All right. Well, actually, my inspiration, because I had not really been trained at all in how to do this. So my inspiration was, I read George Meredith's novel, Diana of the Crossways, which is based in part on Carolyn Norton's diaries. And thought how interesting it would be to actually read diaries by women whom we haven't heard from. Carolyn Norton obviously was a historical figure that had some notoriety in actually pre-Victorian Britain and then on into Victorian Britain. So that and the fact that I was involved with second wave feminisms at that point, as well as history. I was in the process of getting a master's degree in history as well as a PhD in literature and English studies. So that kind of combination is what inspired me to start looking. And then actually I found Matthew's bibliography of, first Matthew's bibliography of autobiographical writing, but from that I, just by sheer chance, and actually another university library other than my own at Iowa State, I found Batt's volume of manuscripts. So it was a lot of serendipity that caused me to go from one source to the next and be interested in this. As I mentioned earlier this morning, no members of my dissertation committee had any idea how to do this at all. And then I met actually at conferences a couple of other young women who were also interested in reading diaries. Suzanne Bunkers, for example, who was interested in particularly looking at American women writers' diaries, and Becky Hogan, who is one of the early editors of AB Autobiography Studies. So the three of us together formed kind of a support group, as it were, for how to read diaries, what made sense in looking at manuscripts. And so actually the first time I looked at manuscript diaries was after I'd gotten a Fulbright grant to go to Britain. And literally just started reading and kind of trying to figure out as I went how it made sense to read diaries. As far as frustration goes, it was frustrating because there are so many stories in any diary. So how do you pick and choose? And I can remember, for example, getting to the point where a woman would give birth and thinking, wait, how did this happen? So then I'd have to go back and reconstruct what clues she'd given the reader that she was going to give birth. I mean, this was the case, for example, in Mary Ann Broome, who was Lord Brome's, second wife, that all of a sudden she'd given birth to his child, and I thought, wait, how did this happen? Well, first of all, there had to be what we call, at least in the US, a shotgun wedding, because she was pregnant. So I had to go back, and there would be feeling unwell today, for example, and reconstruct that. So that was part of learning to read completely differently. So a lot of going back in text. But it's really exciting. I mean, being in the archives is terribly, terribly exciting work. I hope I answered all the parts of that, of your question. did I answer
yes,
all the,
yes,
okay,
yes, yes, yes.
okay, good. I think there's no doubt that they gained quite a bit, both socially and personally, through writing their diaries. That having been said, diaries were also a way, especially for young children, but even later, to force certain kinds of conformity on women. That, for example, that you were supposed to keep track of what you did all hours of the day. So to be a good Victorian woman, you needed to construct not just one diary, but possibly multiple diaries to keep track of your daily life. So there's those kinds of constrictions. But within those kinds of constrictions and subverting those kinds of constrictions, women did gain a personal voice. And the very act of writing itself enables, well, a woman to feel as though she can write. Now, of course, to be a woman novelist was an accepted profession for Victorian women, particularly women whose husbands had died and they needed to support the family and could through writing. But yeah, I mean, the very act of writing itself is terribly important. It inscribes a woman's subjectivity, her life, her hopes, her fears, etc. So the suffragette movement is what you're thinking of in particular, or just more generally women's emancipation? More generally women's emancipation? Yeah, for exactly for the reasons I've actually given, is that by writing, women gain agency that they wouldn't have otherwise. That writing is itself a kind of authorization with all the puns on authorship and what that means, even if diaries were prescribed for women, or being a family chronicler was prescribed for women, contained within those kinds of prescriptions the very fact of putting pen to paper, gestures towards emancipation, I think, for women. I mean, it's not, I don't think we want to say it's a lot, but it's certain necessarily, but it certainly is something. Well, I think it certainly in the 19th, that's truer now. I think than it was in the 19th century. In the 19th century, it's what you as a woman had available to you. So letters, diaries, novels, poetry to some extent. So I think it's more an issue of you take the forms that are available and subvert them, rather than that you pick specific forms. Women becoming poets has been a subversive act for quite a while, because in the hierarchy of the literary canon, poetry is the highest genre. So if you were, you may know Elizabeth Barrett Browning's Aurora Leigh, and of course Aurora crowns herself as a poet in that, and that's very much a subversive act and taking control of her destiny, so to speak. So that would be the case, but I think it is also, as I said, that women use the means, the average woman would use the means available to her, and then write subversion into that, that's more likely. Well, yeah, and Emily Dickinson was, and of course, her poetry, even in the case of Emily Dickinson's poetry, even when I was an undergraduate student, the way Emily Dickinson was interpreted was not feminist at all. I mean, I first learned about Emily Dickinson, and I'm not making this up, from a professor whose last name was Male. And, you know, he characterized her very much as a strange woman who wrote poetry in the family home and never left it. And it wasn't until really I started reading Gilbert and Gubar and The Mad Woman in the Attic and so forth that I thought, wait, this is very different than what I'd been presented with as a student. Right, and I should add that it's not uncommon, and in fact it's quite common for women to write poetry in their diaries. So, and in that sense, but there's still there's a difference between setting yourself up as a poet who's going to be published, hearkening back to Elizabeth Barrett Browning's fictional character Aurora Leigh, and Browning herself as a poet, and writing poetry in your diary. And that isn't to say diaries don't have an audience. In fact, they tend to have an audience. It's usually a family audience. The kind of 20th, 21st century version of diaries is as exclusively for the self or the person who writes them is just not the case at all. But I still think we need to make the distinction between that and more broadly publishing, even if a diary is published, which it could be, within a family, so limited publishing. There's a lot of layers to this. That's a really good point, and it's, I think, a point of what's also happened perhaps with canonization, because Emily Dickinson has definitely long since entered the canon of literature, and it would be great if, in fact, Dickinson's poems were taught in the context of her diary. That would be a cool course, actually. To do. I mean, I don't teach American literature, but well, that's not true. I teach American women writers, but yeah, that would be a very cool course. That they write their autobiographies. Yeah, I mean, they do, because again, that puts them in the tradition. To do so puts them in Victorian England in the tradition of Carlyle's hero worship. And so that gives them status right away. So the notion of being a Victorian sage or a Victorian hero, and Carlyle was one of the writers who certainly wrote biographies of great male figures. And doing that, it's a little bit like Aurora Leigh crowning herself with the laurel leaves. It's saying, I matter. So yeah, I think your point is well made. Right, so, well, it's a combination. It's not really until modernism that the separation of genres is so much. The Victorians didn't worry much about that. They just was more, it's a little bit like Victorian interiors of houses. It's much more of a hodgepodge of genres than the kind of hard and fast distinctions that we think of. Do I have a favorite diary? Well, a diary that I find fascinating is Hannah Culloch, who was, I should say, a Victorian maid of all work. And she wrote the diary at the behest, so under the direction of Arthur Mumby, who was kind of a minor man of letters and a Victorian gentleman. This is second half of the 19th century. And I don't know if it's favorite or if I simply find it fascinating, but Hannah, it's a very strange relationship between Culloch and Mumby, that's putting it mildly. She wore a slave wristband, so to indicate that, with a lock and key, so to indicate a chain around her neck as well as a wristband, to indicate that she was his slave. She blackened herself, and at his insistence, and photographs were taken of her. So she seemed, I know, it's very strange. So she seemed like his slave, but yet she absolutely refused to marry him when he wanted to marry her, because she thought that as a wife she would lose her freedom. She was much stronger than he was. She could literally carry him around. And I find this diary fascinating because it deals with cross-dressing, with race, with gender, with class, you name it. And it's odd, but telling about the intricacies of Victorian culture, and also telling about the way that a woman who's seemingly under a man's thumb isn't necessarily so, that it's much more nuanced than that. So you can read about, actually, Liz Stanley, quite some time ago, edited Culloch's diary. And the originals are at Cambridge, but Stanley's edition gives you a pretty, and she provides contextual material for Hannah's life, Mumby's life, etc., and how to read the diary. So if you do the Diaries of Hannah Culloch, edited by Liz Stanley. A lot, well, not, what I regret is that there actually aren't more diaries available from working class women, because I think that would be really fascinating. It's a social stratum of Victorian culture that we don't really know very much about. And so other than diaries of well-known, authors, I don't regret that as much. We already know quite a bit about them, but there's very little we know about what happened with working women of any kind. And the vast majority of women, in fact, worked. So that's really what I regret. Now, scholars have found some, but not a lot. Yeah, well, that's too bad, actually. Although you never know, somebody might unearth them in the archives.